Victoria Cross 2, the second edition of Victoria Cross by Worthington Games. The original game was a block game that covered the Battle of Rorke's Drift, the famous battle where a small group of British soldiers managed to survive against an overwhelming crowd of Zulu enemies, and that was during the Anglo-Zulu War, 1879, the episode immortalized by the wonderful movie with Michael Caine, and also better games such as the excellent Zulus on the Ramparts. Anyways, in this game, the second edition, you still have the Battle of Rorke's Drift, but you also have a second battle. Whoa, you have a bonus game in here. The Battle of Isandlwana, completely different outcome, because that was a crushing defeat for the British soldiers against the Zulu enemies, and also quite different battle because not a static stand like at Rorke's Drift, but a much more mobile battle in open spaces. So you have two different battles with two potentially different outcomes, but based on the same system. So once you learn the game, then with just a couple of different rules, you can play two battles, which is pretty neat. But let's see how the game handles those two battles. This is the map for the Battle of Rorke's Drift. It looks really nice. It really has this 19th century feel to it. Areas are indicated by these generic lines and then by different types of walls that also create the compound that the British player is trying to defend. The game starts with the British player placing his units in the compound, and then during the movement phase of turn 1, the Zulu player will start bringing units in from the edges of the map, and those units of course will converge against the compound. The compound has different types of walls that work in slightly different ways. The compound also has a special area, such as this one. This is the roof of a building. Only the British player can have units there. This is the area where reduced British units can be brought back to full strength. Full units have 2 strength points. When they're reduced, they go down to 1. If they go down to 0, they're gone. But if they're down to 1 and they start their turn here, then they can go back to their first strength, to 2 strength points. Only 2 units per turn can be healed that way. Another important area is the hospital, this area here, where the British player places some special units, which are wounded units. Units are placed there at the beginning of the game. Those units cannot move by themselves, so the British player needs other units to move them, and he will need to move them out of the hospital most likely, because if the Zulu player attacks the hospital with a melee attack, then players have to start rolling dice, because at that point the hospital may start burning. If that happens, then again players will need to roll every turn to see how the fire progresses, and most likely the hospital will burn down at some point. When the hospital collapses, all the units inside the hospital are eliminated, so the British player will want his wounded units and also his combat units to survive the fire. And that is particularly true because if the wounded units are eliminated, either because they're captured or because they are in the hospital when the hospital collapses, those units will give victory points to the Zulu player, so it is pretty important to protect them. The Zulu player can have up to 90 points of strength points on the map at any one time, which is a lot of strength points. The Zulu player also, during his movement phase, can receive replacement to replace the strength points that were eliminated the previous turn. A unit was here and it was eliminated, then next turn the Zulu player receives 10 strength points that can be brought in from the edge of the map. So at least those units are slowed down because they have to come back from the outside of the map, but there's just no way for the British player to completely stop the charge of the enemy units. In a turn, first the British player can move any and all of his units. Units usually move by one area to an adjacent area. They cannot move diagonally, but a leader can move up to 4 strength points of units by an additional area for a total of 2 areas. Zulu units also move by 1 normally. Smaller units can be consolidated in larger units. Large units can be broken down in small units. Complete freedom here in the way the Zulu player can manage his strength points on the map, but usually units move by 1 area unless they are with a leader. Any leader can move up to 10 strength points of units by an extra area. Also, Zulu units can be used face down to create an effect of fog of war so that the British player doesn't know exactly how strong each group of Zulu units is. Once all movement is completed, the bloodbath starts. First, you have the fire combat phase. The British player always fires first. Any of his units can fire as long as they are in range and they have a line of sight to the opponent. Each zone will tell you which other zones can be reached by fire combat and at what range. For example, if you're in this zone here, then you can fire in zone 2, zone J, which is this one, and zone F, which is in this direction, at range 1. Other zones, for example, zone 12, are at range 2. Once line of sight and range have been determined, the British player rolls a die for each strength point firing and uses this table here. A unit firing at range 3 hits on a 5 or 6, 2 zones for 5 or 6, and units firing at adjacent enemies hit with 3 or more. So as you can see, firing at adjacent enemies can be particularly devastating. Then the Zulu player can execute random firing return. This firing is abstracted. It is not based on position of enemy or friendly units. I guess it is assumed that there are Zulus everywhere on the map, so they can attack pretty much anywhere. So the Zulu player simply chooses the area or areas where he wants to direct the Zulu random fire with just the exclusion of a couple of areas. Then the Zulu player rolls 6 dice during day turns and 4 dice during night turns and scores a hit on the opponent for each 6 that is rolled. If directing random fire into zone J, then the Zulu player actually hits on a 5 or 6. After fire combat, surviving Zulu units that are adjacent to British units can launch melee attacks. Melee is resolved simultaneously. Both players will roll. Potentially each strength point of units involved in melee can roll a die, and the Zulu units will score a hit on the opponent for each 6 that they roll, and the British units will score a hit for each 5 or 6 that they roll. But limitations will come from the presence of walls. Only up to 8 strength points can attack from one area into another area using melee combat, so that will greatly limit the effectiveness of large groups of Zulu units, and this is why probably the Zulu player will want to attack the same area from different directions at the same time, because that limitations only apply to each area from which melee combat is launched. In this case, for example, 16 strength points could be used by the Zulu player to launch melee combat in that area. Luckily enough, the British player has another advantage, that is, when performing melee combat across a wall, the British player receives a +1 to his die rolls. That means that the British player will actually score a hit for each 4, 5, or 6 that is rolled, not just for each 5 or 6. Leaders can also direct special attacks. After melee resolution, a leader can lead up to 4 strength points of units into a bayonet charge against adjacent units, and that means that that leader will generate the extra rounds of melee combat between his units and enemy units, and he can repeat that procedure. He can launch as many bayonet charges and extra rounds of melee combat as he wants, or of course until he has people that are alive to execute those charges. Another type of special attack is the volley fire, which can be executed by units that did not move during the movement phase. So during the movement phase, you place a marker there to indicate that they can execute the volley fire. Then the leader can direct up to 4 strength points of units to execute volley fire against enemy units that are adjacent to them and not separated by a wall. If those conditions apply, the units that are executing volley fire roll up to 3 times as many dice as they normally would, which is a lot of fire. The Zulu player wins the game if he eliminates enough British units to leave less than 10 strength points of British units on the map, or if he earns 14 victory points, and the Zulu player can earn those by taking control of specific objectives on the map or by eliminating wounded units of the opponent. The British player wins the game if he survives until the end of turn 16 and prevents the opponent from winning the game before then. Battle of Isand Luana. Here, the British player again sets up on the map, and the Zulu player will enter the map later. What the Zulu player is trying to do is to take control of these victory point areas that the British player will defend. There are some interesting features on the map. There are two dongas here and a ridge up there. These features will affect the line of sight and movement. Also, the British player has some new types of units here. Cavalry units that can move up to 2 areas per turn. British native units that cannot participate to fire combat, they can only enter melee combat, and an artillery unit with a quite strong firepower of 6, but that unit can only fire or move, not both during the same turn. Also, that unit only has 1 strength point during melee combat. The Zulu player will enter the board from that edge there during the first couple of turns, but then starting from turn 4, he'll be allowed to bring in units from this area here, and from turn 6 to bring units from that area there, which places him quite close already to the victory point area. So things are going to be tricky here for the British player, as Zulu units are going to sneak around starting from here and trying to go to the victory point areas. The game in general is very light, very simple. You move and then you roll buckets of dice, so it is not going to take you that long to figure it out. And yes, you do roll a lot of dice. Now, it is true that there is an optional rule that allows you to use charts, combat charts that reduce the number of dice that you roll. But actually, you know what? I like it. I like rolling big amounts of dice, tossing 20 dice on the table. The noise of the dice that roll, that crowd of dice that is going all around the table, to me works thematically. It almost seems to me to emphasize the theme of the intense volley fire coming from the British player and the large crowds of Zulu warriors rushing against the British player. It works. It makes the game, the experience of the game, noisy and messy, which is, I think, what this should be. And the game is noisy and messy in a way that, because the number of casualties is going to be intense, the brutality, the violence of the confrontation is going to be huge, and it is what it should be. It really works with the theme. It is not a nice, elegant game. It is a game that mirrors, I believe, the violence of the original events. It is a non-symmetrical game, always a plus in my book. The British player and the Zulu player have completely different resources and limitations. Of course, the British player relies on quality and extremely powerful firepower. On the other hand, the Zulu player has numbers, and yet the Zulu player cannot just rely on numbers. If he just sends in huge charges of Zulu warriors, those will be mowed down and destroyed before they can do anything. It really is a matter of cunning, or be able to exploit leader movement to trick the British player to manage to attack from areas that the British player does not expect. One thing that worries me a little is replay value, because, well, as a Zulu player, you will mainly direct the action. The British player will have to react to what you do. Of course, sometimes we'll try to prevent you, to see what you're going to do in advance, but it's still a matter of reacting to the Zulu player. And as the Zulu player, you will soon figure out that there are areas on the map that are particularly favorable to you, that make it easier, safer, more effective to you to attack from that area rather than another one. So I'm just afraid that in the long run, certain sequences of events and actions will settle, and players will tend to rely on those sequences of actions more than on others. On the other hand, here you get two games that play differently depending on the side. So if you play both games a couple of times, being sometimes the British player, sometimes the Zulu player, I think that you can still get enough gaming out of this game that to make your investment worth it, because the game is not even very expensive, so that's another plus. So bottom line, this is a game that I find very enjoyable. It is very light, approachable. It has a nice pace, definitely moments of intense tension. I would recommend it to anyone who has any interest in the theme, or just generally speaking for anyone who is looking for a fun, light war game.